many people still believe in the Jokowi story too. So, clearly he has changed some things. Clearly he was a different kind of figure. But I just think he never was as transformative as he allowed people to believe he was. And as I argue in my book, a much more contradictory figure than many people really acknowledge.
Hello and welcome to On the Level. I'm Jeff Hutton. Today, Ben Bland on his new book, Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. Ben Bland was the Financial Times correspondent in Indonesia from 2012 before heading off to Vietnam and later Hong Kong. Amazingly, Ben has written the first English language biography of Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, as he's better known. Now, I say amazingly because Jokowi's story is so compelling. He's self-made, rising from poverty in Surakarta, or Solo, to build a furniture exporting company, later winning election as mayor of the city, and then governorship of Jakarta. And then the top job as president in 2014. I remember that time. It felt as if Indonesia was reborn, because in Jokowi, the country was choosing a somewhat awkward everyman to lead them. He turned the notion of government on its head as something meant to serve the people rather than the other way around. Jokowi made at least a modest start providing health care for the poor and spruced up public centers, famously organizing food stalls into purpose-built centers rather than leaving them to their own devices on curbsides where they fouled up the traffic. These were small fixes, they're low-hanging fruit, but they made a difference. And they won him media acclaim. But getting to the top of the greasy pole of politics in Indonesia, Jokowi has needed to co-opt the elite that he was supposedly circumnavigating. Suharto-era generals populate Jokowi's inner circle. His opponent, Prabowo Subianto, is Jokowi's defense minister. One part of Ben's book I could identify with was the challenges of interviewing Jokowi himself. He's genial and quietly charismatic, but he's also pretty taciturn. He's not given to riffs on political theory or personal anecdotes. The first time I met Jokowi was while he was Jakarta governor. I struck out on one of his famous bluskons, the spontaneous inspections. This was of a public housing complex. Jokowi ambled up to me and shooed me onto his bus and gave me a one-on-one with him. He was just a month away from formally announcing his candidacy for president. The trip was no more than 30 minutes. Of course, we were in a motorcade, and thanks to the police escort, we got there pretty fast. But by the time we got there, I was running out of things to ask him. He never varied too far away from his stock answer to virtually anything, which was something along the lines of, we will do the work of the people. We must find what the people want and work hard to deliver it. We must go to the ground and do what the people want. Never mind questions like leaders he admires or personal challenges that informed his thinking or what he sees as the big questions the next government will need to answer. Nah. In fact, he was getting kind of annoyed. And I was left thinking, geez, I'm striking out here. Well, along comes Ben's book to tell me I wasn't alone. Ben is currently the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. When he was here in Jakarta, I got to know him as a tough, informed, disciplined, and talented reporter's reporter. I have enormous respect for Ben, and getting his take on the Sphinx-like Joko Widodo was a real treat. My friends, here's Ben Bland. Ben Bland, welcome to the pod. I'm so happy to have you.
Great to be with you, Jeff.
Is this the first English language autobiography of Joko Widodo? How could that be? How could it be that the president of Indonesia, the fourth most populous president, has never had an English language biography written of him?
Well, I was quite surprised myself to discover this when I set off on my research. It's obviously good for me in a sense that there's an opening in the market. I think there's probably two main reasons. Firstly, to be fair, Jokowi is only 6 years into his presidency, although he did have a career beforehand as a mayor and governor of Jakarta. So I guess maybe there are other people who are looking and waiting till he's finished his term in office so they can look back on the full spectrum of his career leading Indonesia. I think the other probably more pertinent point is just the general lack of interest in Indonesia from the rest of the world and from publishers. I've been wanting to write a book about Indonesia for many years, since I moved to Jakarta as an FT correspondent some years ago. And throughout various conversations with publishers, they would just say things like, we like your ideas, we love your writing, but can you pick another country? Because no one cares about Indonesia. So I think I know it's sad, right? But it speaks to what I think John Riyadi, the tycoon, said. Indonesia is the world's biggest invisible object. So it just doesn't register in the wider world. It's hard to get people interested, and therefore, in a book industry where churning out so many works but making so little profit, there's just not that much of a business case for taking a book on Indonesia, and it becomes a chicken and egg issue because not much is being published. There's not much known, and not much desire to publish anything else. And so instead, we've seen hundreds of books on President Trump. There's even a book about writing about President Trump that came out recently.
What? No.
Seriously, it's crazy. From the Washington Post's literary critic, a book that I never want to read.
And hopefully in a few months we'll never need to. It's all the more baffling to me as one who has covered Joko Widodo as well. The story itself just is almost stuff of Hollywood. He rises from poverty, from a slum on the edge of a river, and makes his way up the very slippery political pool in Indonesia. That in itself is fascinating. A potted history of Joko Widodo up until this point, political history of Joko Widodo up until this point.
Well, yeah, as you say, it's a really remarkable story. Some people in the early days compared his meteoric rise to Barack Obama, but Joko Widodo is a very different figure, and Indonesia is a very different country. So while Barack Obama in his 30s was, a Harvard law graduate, he'd written his own autobiography at that point about how great he was and how he would change America, and had aspirations to lead. At that point, Jokowi, as he was known, was running a small furniture factory in Solo, his hometown, also known as Surakarta, city of some 500,000 people, churning out beds and chairs and desks, and sort of traveling the world at furniture expos. So it's really quite a remarkable rise from this small furniture maker. He first entered politics in 2005, running for the mayoralty of Solo. He won that election. He was re-elected 5 years later with 90% of the vote. Quite a remarkable result, I think, which told him that he had this ability to connect with voters, that he was a bit special in Indonesian politics. So from there, he then later went to run in the governorship of Jakarta, 2012, as an underdog, won that race, and then just 2 years later, jumped straight into the presidency, won, and then was re-elected with a bigger margin last year. So really a remarkable rise. It was just 2 years from when he was mayor of a city of some 500,000 people to president of a nation of 270 million people. And it's not just the rapidity, the speed of his rise that's so astonishing, but the fact that he managed to defeat so many established players in the Indonesian political scene. He defeated kind of the matriarch of PDIP, Megawati Sukarno Putri, who was still eyeing the presidency for herself or her daughter, Prabowo Subianto, a former son-in-law of Suharto, former head of the Indonesian Special Forces, and a bunch of other rich business people, politicians from the elite. So a remarkable rise on at least two fronts. And also, I think the third point that we have to understand is Jokowi embodied kind of the promise of democratization in Indonesia after the fall of Suharto, that someone could come from nowhere, from a poor background to the top by virtue of hard work and winning local elections and showing that they could govern cleanly and effectively. It told Indonesians that there was hope and that democracy was working for them. So really, quite an incredible story on so many fronts.
I just went through my memory catalog of what it was like when I first arrived in 2012. And that was, when did you arrive here? About the same time, right?
Same time, yeah, 2012.
Right, okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression was that, wow, the place is really hopping. There's change. This guy has a track record, and as a Western reporter, we could really sink our teeth into this because he was kind of speaking our language. He was savvy with the media. He was able to point to a track record. He was speaking to all the right sort of sound bites, right? Like sort of, we have to draw a line on the past. We have human rights. We need to reform. It was really, I don't know about you, but it's ringing my bell. When you think back to that, what was your impression of that time?
I agree with you. There's something intoxicating about his political rise, and I'd lived in Indonesia for a bit beforehand, but coming back as a foreign correspondent for the first time in 2012, working for the Financial Times, I went straight into this campaign for the governorship of Jakarta, where Jokowi was the underdog, but he was promising to clean everything up. He did have different messaging to different people, but he did go out there and speak to foreign journalists and made an effort to court that constituency of people, and he was quite clever at the messaging there. But more generally, I remember going to his rallies, seeing these Indonesian rock bands who are his strongest supporters. And one thing that sticks in my mind is that going to one of the big campaign rallies in Jakarta and seeing people paying with their own money to buy Jokowi campaign t-shirts, people who were not rich, spending, whatever it was, 40, 50,000 rupiah on a campaign t-shirt. And I remember going to a rally for Fuzzy Bowo, who was the incumbent, largely expected to win early on. And his people in the more kind of traditional campaigning style were just giving out t-shirts. He'd got the rich business people and politicians of Jakarta to fund his campaign, and they were just giving out the attribute, the t-shirts, the flags and everything else to people in a very kind of mechanistic way. But Jokowi had this ground-up connection with people. But actually, what I found interesting at the time was he didn't really say much. I mean, I agree when he sat down with foreign media, he did talk a bit more about reform, etc. But whether it was those interviews or his campaign speeches, he was actually quite limited in what he said. Mostly he talked about his track record, about the simple way he did things, going to the people, asking them what was wrong, finding solutions. And I just found it fascinating that a man who really actually said so little could really turbocharge Indonesian politics in this way. And I think partly it was about the vacuum at the top of Indonesian politics. So you did have all these elite figures operating in that space, but they were so unattractive to so many Indonesian voters. They weren't new faces. They were doing business, the way it had been done for a while. And there was a sort of frustration with democratization as it had been, the sense that it had been co-opted by corrupt interests. And Jokowi, merely by his backstory and by kind of his political marketing, remember those red and white red, white and blue check shirts. Yeah, the baju kotak that he wore, which symbolized, man of the people, hardworking. That was something that Jokowi gamed out with his advisors. He thought through very carefully how to project this image. And he was very successful at showing himself to Indonesian voters as a different kind of leader who would shake things up. And I think it speaks to his skills, but it also speaks to the kind of weaknesses in the rest of the political system, I think.
Do you think that we Western reporters, were projecting a little on him of what we wanted to see? Because what he was then and what he turned out to be, as your book portends, as your title pretends, very different. Do you think that we were part of the myth making?
For sure. And that was part of Jokowi's tactics. He courted foreign investors and the foreign media to show to Indonesian voters that he was respected from the outside, that he was a substantive figure, that he was a change maker. Of course, the Indonesian media had a big role to play there too. Personally, I would say, and of course I would say this, I don't think I was that taken in. I could feel myself being
You're so
sucked
cynical, Ben.
into the emotion. I'm not cynical, but I like to analyze things. I like to go to the ground, as Jokowi would put it, and find out what's really going on. So I remember, and I did check back, in 2014, before the presidential election, I wrote a column about how Jokowi was effectively being sucked up into a vacuum, that he hadn't actually said or done that much. But the lack of other alternatives at the top basically was just pulling him in to a position of power. And it was partly about what he'd done, but also about the lack of other alternatives. Yeah. And when I went to Solo Widodo back in 2014 to examine his track record. Sure, from a solo small city perspective, he'd done some good things, but it was very limited. It's not as if Solo was turned into Singapore or Abu Dhabi overnight. It's still a kind of small, messy Indonesian city. He just helped, to fix it in some ways, but he was always an incrementalist, and I think people were too sucked into that story. But, so were many Indonesian activists who are among his strongest supporters. So is the Indonesian media and many Indonesian voters. And to a great extent, if you look at the polling and the election result last year, many people still believe in the Jokowi story too. So, clearly he has changed some things. Clearly he was a different kind of figure. But I just think he never was as transformative as he allowed people to believe he was. And as I argue in my book, a much more contradictory figure than many people really acknowledge.
100%. That the man of contradictions. I wonder if you could walk us through some of the main ways that he seems to, at the one hand, be a reformer, and on the other hand, be a very much a champion or supporter of the status quo, but by dint of all the Suharto generals that are in his cabinet and his inner circle. Walk us through the varying ways that he's on the one hand this and on the other hand that.
This idea really came to me from one of his ministers. So when I was trying to work out, how do I make a sense of Jokowi, it was very confounding, because he's the sort of leader, when you think he's in a strong position and he's going to take control, he does things that look very weak, like he's really a puppet of Megawati or other interests. And at other times, when you think he's weak, he's lost all his power, he's just being pushed around, he suddenly does something which really surprises you by stamping his authority on the situation. And I remember asking one of his ministers, come on, tell me, how do I really make sense of him? And the minister said to me, well, look, Jokowi is a bundle of contradictions, like all Indonesians or like all people, really, which is true. I think there's a kind of a deeper truth here about us all, that we don't like to think of ourselves in that way, but we are all contradictory, and I see it in Jokowi's leadership, and I think this reflects certain contradictions in Indonesia. So if you look at this question of Jokowi the reformer, for example, at times he's hinted at it, he's put it in some of his manifestos, certainly in international media. If you read Bloomberg, Reuters, he is portrayed to the world as a reformer. But actually Jokowi, I would argue, is a small c conservative, in a sense that he's an incrementalist. He doesn't seek to push for dramatic change, and he always works with the powers that be. And that was from his very early days in the city hall in Solo. He didn't seek to completely transform it. He took, as he told me himself, 3 years to win over the trust of the workers in City Hall, the local bureaucrats. So rather than trying to back them into a corner, he tried to win them over in a more traditionally Javanese style. I think that's one of the contradictions. We also see, the story of Jokowi the outsider. That's what allowed him to rise to the top so quickly, that he promised a different way of doing things, a more humble, clean, people-focused style of leadership. But instead, we've seen Jokowi transform into a consummate transactional elite politician, able to pull 75% of the parliament behind him, now smoothing the path for his son and son-in-law into politics, thereby forming his own political dynasty. A very deep contradiction there. And there are so many others. And another one I find fascinating is the contradiction between his concentration of power, which reflects this coalition he's built, and his willingness to use it, which again is very, very rare. There are very few occasions on which Jokowi is really willing to push ahead with key decisions, and even when he does, he seems to surprise you. He pushes ahead on the strange things, not the things you'd expect. And just the last point I'd make is Jokowi often presents himself, and he's described as a technocrat. This speaks to his background as a businessman and a mayor, sort of solving practical issues. But actually what we see in the presidential palace, he doesn't like to listen to experts. He doesn't like to listen to technocrats. He's actually much more of an instinctive politician. He goes with his impulse, his intuition. So again, another contradiction there between how he presents himself and how he really is. And then I think there's a broader slate of contradictions in Indonesian history and politics that I think Jokowi also is kind of struggling to tackle, or at least struggling to reconcile these deeper tensions in Indonesian history, as well as the kind of paradoxes of his own leadership.
We just had the return of Rizik Shihab, the firebrand leader of the Islamic Defenders Front, the architect of the December 2016 protests that helped seal the fate of Jokowi's one-time ally, Basuki Purnama. How should we see that event, his reaction to it, that fateful walk in the rain to go tour the protests, as one of the contradictions? And do you think he, in hindsight, he handled it correctly?
Well, I'd make two general points first before getting on to the specifics. I mean, the first would be there is really a circular nature to politics in Indonesia and an incredible willingness or ability to forgive and forget and move on. And we don't just see this with Habib Rizik, we see this with Basuki Cahayapurnama, Ahok himself, because after his downfall, after Jokowi abandoned him under pressure of this mass movement and Ahok's conviction for blasphemy, jailing for 2 years, he's been semi-rehabilitated. Now he's the chairman of Pertamina, the national oil and gas company, reappointed by Jokowi. So he's come back. Then you can look at the Jokowi-Prabowo relationship. Prabowo, we must remember, actually backed Jokowi's run for Jakarta governor in 2012, provided a lot of financing, provided a lot of US Republican political advisors who helped Jokowi to win the campaign. Then they fell out when Jokowi stole the presidency, fought these two bitterly fought elections, and then Jokowi reconciled by making Prabowo defense minister. So I'm not surprised in a way to see Rizik basically pushed out of the country effectively and now brought back potentially with some sort of understanding with the Indonesian government, so that speaks to the circular nature. The second thing I'd say is this tension, if you like, between the state and Islam goes back to Indonesia's founding in 1945. Indonesia is in a very unusual place for a Muslim majority nation of not having any Islam in the constitution. And that stems from this compromise among the founders of Indonesia between the secularists like Sukarno and others who wanted Sharia law, who wanted Islam in the constitution. So they decided to make Indonesia a religious nation, not a secular nation, as it's often mistakenly called, but a religious nation with 6 official religions. And this messy compromise, which worked out initially, has been tested ever since by a series of rebellions, uprisings. We've seen mass violence across the country and mass peaceful movements like we saw in the campaign against Ahok. And I think we have to see FPI, Habib Rizik, kind of in the broader history of this struggle in Indonesia between those who want to put Islam sort of at the heart of the state and those who want to keep a more balanced, pluralistic vision for Indonesia. So I think we see that battle ongoing. As to the question of Habib Rizik himself and what happens, he's kind of implied there was some sort of deal reached with the Indonesian authorities where they would allow him to come back and not pursue any of the criminal cases that were in the offing before that seemed to have precipitated his rapid departure for Saudi Arabia, officially, I think, to go on Umrah, on pilgrimage, but seemingly as well to escape some of these charges. So there seems to have reached some sort of deal, but it's not clear how that's going to hold. I mean, he's already come back and started talking about a revolution, albeit a moral revolution. He said he's happy to reconcile with the government so long as they, don't go after the religious leaders and they show efforts to reconcile with Muslims, including potentially by releasing Abu Bakr Bashir, the other sort of firebrand cleric who helped to promote the Bali bombings. So it remains to be seen how the authorities and Habib Rizik are going to manage this rather tense relationship. And I think it also remains to be seen how much influence he has. I mean, I remember back in 2012-13, FPI, the Islamic Defenders Front, his group, was really just a small, thuggish vigilante gang that was trying to extract money from bars during Ramadan or mini-marts selling alcohol and the like, doing sweeping, as they called it. And it has links going back to 1998 to the military. Suharto himself has admitted that he worked with Habib Rizik and FPI back then because they thought it was useful having this sort of gang of hardline Islamists as a tool they could use to try and ensure stability in their eyes. So it remains to be seen how much public support there really is for him and if he's able to kind of work with elite politicians to parlay that public support into real political influence. And I think whenever you see this combination of kind of firebrand figures, mass ground movements and elite politics, it's always hard to know how they're going to intermingle and who will come out on top. You never know if it's the people at the top manipulating the public or it's really changes in public sentiment that are driving these political shifts. So I think it's still early days on that front. But, we must acknowledge in the 2019 election, Prabowo tried to use his connection to Habib Rizik and the kind of momentum from the anti-Ahok campaign to buoy his presidential campaign, and he lost.
Yep. As we look past into the past 6 years, we have these contradictions, we have these disappointments, sort of the realization, of course, long ago, that he's not what we thought he would be, Jokowi. Speaking personally as a gay man, married, making a life for ourselves in Jakarta, our lives are worse off now, personally, under in Indonesia with Jokowi at the top. But by and large, his stewardship, how would you rate it? Is Indonesia better off now, just to use the Republican, the Ronald Reagan measure, better off now than they were 6 years ago? And I would have to answer yes, because mainly, and this is kind of faint praise, of the absence of negatives. There's more infrastructure, yes, there's some investment, but there's the absence of demagoguery. In a time of Brexit and Trump and Xi Jinping and Orban, he didn't go down that road, and he could. And for a guy who wasn't steeped in the minutia of policy, he didn't get any training at defense staff colleges in the U.S. He doesn't speak English that well at all. He is really a terrible interview. I like speaking with him, but he doesn't give a whole lot away. For a guy who you say is fairly incurious and very instinctual and transactional, yet overall, his stewardship seems to be, on the whole, good. How would you grade it?
I think you portrayed him very fairly, and my book isn't a hatchet job, as some people who haven't read it have accused it of being. It's really, the idea of Contradictions is to show this kind of the yin and the yang. Also, to put Jokowi in the context of Indonesia and the struggle to build this nation out of thousands of islands and hundreds of languages and ethnicities. There's really, all they shared in 1945 were the arbitrary limits of Dutch colonial expansion, exploration and exploitation. So it's really a remarkable story, and I think it depends on timeline, right? If you compare Jokowi's track record to the highest hopes in the early days, then maybe it's disappointing. But when you position it in the trajectory of this Indonesia's second struggle to build democracy, I agree with you. I think things haven't gone too badly. It also depends who you are, right? As you say, if you're in the LGBT community, if you're in certain other minority groups, it's not been good. That's clear. But I would say that those trend lines, this is not excusing Jokowi, who obviously said it on the record, he's not really interested in these issues. But the trend lines were there from the Yudhoyono administration, I think, in terms of the persecution of minorities, the kind of growing majoritarian rule. So that's not something that's driven by him. It's certainly not something he's done to correct. And it's definitely got worse on his watch. But more broadly, Indonesia is a developing country. Its people want to see the economy growing, more jobs. And he has pushed the economy along. He's pushed the infrastructure along, hasn't got anywhere near his own kind of hopes to get up to 7% a year GDP growth, stuck before COVID-19 at around 5%. But I think he hasn't done a bad job. And as you say, he hasn't been a populist. A lot of the academics who look at Indonesia call him a populist, but I find it totally misleading. I mean, he's not like a conventional populist. He doesn't claim to be the sole voice of all Indonesians. He accepts sort of pluralism in Indonesia, for sure. He works with the elite. He doesn't pitch himself against the elite, and that has its downsides. But it means he's not trying, by and large, to divide Indonesians into different kinds of groups. And that means we have a certain ineffectiveness in government, but it also means the flip side of that is a certain resilience in Indonesian society. And, you can't cure all Indonesia's problems in one go. So I think when you look at it in the broader context, he hasn't done that badly. And you have to hope that he's shown that things can be done a bit better, and that others will kind of take up that baton of incremental improvement and maybe bring a bit more focus into thinking about how to get things done. Because as you say, he is somewhat incurious, he's somewhat instinctive. There hasn't been enough of an effort to build a machinery to implement the sorts of reforms that he talks about from time to time. So that would be my hope for things going forward. But it's difficult. And I would say my fear is that Indonesia is effectively on this suboptimal but not terrible development trajectory. but the world's getting more competitive, right? Vietnam, other countries, they're not going to wait for Indonesia. They're going to push ahead, developing their manufacturing sectors and the like, trying to attract foreign investment. And this is a competition. And I do worry that those 3 million or so young Indonesians entering the workforce every year, where are the jobs going to come from for those people, even before the pandemic, which makes things so much worse, unfortunately. And that's the concern for me, that, is Indonesia really going to capitalize on this demographic dividend? And generally, you would expect that the growth trajectory as you get bigger and richer will slow down. So if they're not even sort of getting anywhere near the 7% rate beforehand, we can expect a gradual slowing of that. And what does that imply for a society that's still extremely, extremely unequal? So it's not just the LGBT community, but effectively, 20-30% of Indonesians are living in and around poverty, maybe only 10% in poverty, but there's another perhaps 20% who are cycling in and out or just above the poverty line. And while life may have got marginally better for them, it's a very, very slow improvement. And I wonder where the future growth is going to come for those people. So that's my concern, that, Indonesians should generally expect more of their leaders, but it's just hard in such a big country. It's hard when you have a messy democratic system. But I do think the flip side of decentralization and democratization is a sort of social cohesion in Indonesia. I'm much more optimistic about social cohesion than a lot of people. You always read these stories whenever anything happens about, is Indonesia going to descend into social disorder? But I think having all these different local leaders and local parliaments and having these competing interest groups, in a way, gives a certain stickiness to Indonesian society, that there are ways to let off steam, way to resolve issues politically, even though it doesn't necessarily lead to ideal policy outcomes.
I want to wrap this up in a minute, but before I let you go, just the way that you were answering that question makes me think that I'm talking to a guy who left Indonesia, but Indonesia didn't leave him, to be sort of cliched. You moved on to, I think, to Vietnam and then to Hong Kong, and now you're in Sydney with the Lowy Institute. You sound like you miss Indonesia. Is your heart still here, Ben?
Oh, for sure. I love my time in Indonesia. I lived in Indonesia for 4 years in total, but I spent many more years studying Indonesia, going back and visiting, learning Indonesian. And it's just a fantastic country with great people, great stories if you're a journalist or now a think tank researcher, and just a certain openness. I know it's potentially got a bit more difficult in the last few years for Indonesian and foreign journalists and researchers. But generally speaking, the ability to go there, to get access to top leaders, but also when you travel around, as you do as well, Jeff, the many islands of Indonesia, kind of the warm welcome you generally receive from people, even when they're going through terrible, terrible situations, terrorist attacks, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, mining disputes. People always receive you well and want to tell you their stories, and I think
they want to talk to you. That's amazing. I love it here.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to something in the Indonesian character and in the democratic system, that Indonesians want to have a voice. They want to have their voice heard in their own country. They want to have their voice heard in the world. I always remember being so touched on election day, which is, it's a national holiday in Indonesia, when you go out to the kind of poor areas and people put on their best clothes and makeup to go and vote because it matters to them. Turnout in the last election, I think, was over 80%. The sorts of levels, it would be unimaginable in any democracy without compulsory voting. And I think that speaks to the strength of Indonesia and just something that's fascinating for outsiders to engage with. So I still love coming back. Hopefully I can get to come back again soon, because it's just a fascinating place. And like you say, once you've been there, you never really forget. And, particularly being here in Australia, being in a neighboring country, I really feel excited and enthusiastic about the potential to work in my own very small way to improve kind of relations, to engage more with Indonesia, because it is just such an interesting, exciting place. And I think Jokowi in the end sort of embodies, the potential and the limits of Indonesia. But I think on both sides, it's just a fascinating story and amazing country.
Ben, thank you so much for joining me. Congratulations on the book. It's getting lots of mentions. I think it even got a mention in The Economist, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I was really chuffed to see that. And it didn't mention Indonesia being at a crossroads, which is good.
Love the tweets too. Ben Bland, all the best. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff. Great talking with you.
And that's the pod. Thanks so much to Ben Bland for joining me. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Research by Imam Shofwan. Music by Soundstripe. You can always reach us on Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. And if you like us, please subscribe and rate us. I'm Jeff Hutton. I'll be back next week with more stories that are on the level.